Humans have been dying for hundreds of thousands of years. But have you ever wondered what happens after death? People have had many different ideas about what comes next, but the ancient Egyptians had a very different idea about what happened after death. What did the ancient Egyptians actually believe happened after death? To answer that, we have to go back thousands of years, to a strip of green land surrounded by desert, where a river called the Nile decided who lived and who starved. The Egyptians watched that river flood every year and bring life back to dead soil. And somewhere in watching that cycle, they started to believe that death might work the same way. Not as an ending, but as a kind of crossing, a door instead of a wall. Most cultures around the world had their own answers to the question of death. But the Egyptians believed something stranger and far more detailed. They believed that a person did not just have one self. This is where it gets interesting. The Egyptians believed every person had something called a ka, which you can think of as a kind of life force, almost like an energy double of the person that came into existence the moment they were born. They also believed in something called a ba, which was closer to a person's individual personality, the things that made them who they were. Think of the ba as the part of you that your friends would recognize even from a distance. Your walk, your laugh, your way of telling a story. The Egyptians believed the ba could travel during the day, but it needed to return each night to a place it recognized. And what did the ba need to return to? This is the piece that changes everything. The Egyptians believed the ba needed to return to the body. If a person's continued existence depended on the ka and the ba being able to recognize and return to the body, then what happens if the body is destroyed? To the Egyptians, this wasn't just a sad thought. It was a genuine danger. If the body was lost, the person could be lost with it, cut off from the parts of themselves they needed to keep existing, so the body needed to be protected. Not out of simple respect, but because in their eyes it was the anchor holding a person's whole identity in place. This is where preserving the body becomes important. But here's something people often get wrong. The Egyptians did not wake up one day and invent embalming out of nowhere. It happened gradually, almost by accident, long before anyone fully understood why it worked. In the earliest days, Egyptians buried their dead directly in shallow pits in the desert sand without coffins. And the desert did something unexpected. The hot, dry sand pulled the moisture out of the bodies naturally, and in the right conditions, some of those bodies did not fully decay. They dried out instead. Imagine digging in the sand centuries later and finding a body that still looked strangely intact. That discovery alone would raise a lot of questions. Over time, as Egyptians began building proper tombs and coffins to protect their dead from animals and grave robbers, something changed. Bodies placed inside coffins, away from the direct dry sand, decayed much faster. The very thing meant to protect the body was working against it. So the Egyptians had to find a new way to do what the desert had once done on its own. That search became the beginning of true mummification. Now picture trying to solve this problem in a world with no refrigerators, no laboratory chemicals, and no modern medical tools. Just careful observation, trial and error, and generations of embalmers passing down what worked and quietly dropping what didn't. What they eventually developed was a careful, deliberate process. It started with cleaning the body. Then came one of the most important discoveries in this entire story, a naturally occurring salt called natron. Natron worked almost like the desert sand once had, drawing moisture out of the body and helping to stop decay before it could take hold. The body would be covered in this salt and left for a number of weeks, slowly drying out. Certain internal organs were removed and preserved separately since they tended to decay the fastest. These preserved organs were placed into special containers known as canopic jars, each one often protected by the image of a different guardian. The heart, however, was usually left inside the body because the Egyptians believed it held a person's memories, emotions, and character. In their eyes, it was almost like the control center of who someone truly was. Once the body had fully dried, it would be cleaned again, sometimes treated with oils and resins, and then carefully wrapped in long strips of linen. This wasn't a quick process. Embalmers would wrap layer after layer, sometimes placing protective amulets between the layers, small objects believed to offer protection on the journey ahead. Finally, the wrapped body would be placed into a coffin, sometimes nested inside multiple coffins, and prepared for burial. You've probably heard the number 70 connected to Egyptian mummification, and that number deserves its own moment, because it raises an obvious question. Why would preparing one body take over 2 months? The truth is, the process varied quite a bit depending on the time period and how wealthy the family was. But traditional accounts describe a process lasting around 70 days in total, combining the drying stage with time spent on wrapping, rituals, and final preparations. It wasn't rushed because rushing wasn't the point. Every stage was believed to matter for the person's journey ahead, and skipping steps risked leaving that journey incomplete. But here's something important to understand. Mummification alone was never considered enough. The Egyptians believed the preserved body was just one part of a much larger system meant to support a person after death. The tomb itself was filled with objects the person might need: food, tools, sometimes models of servants, or scenes from daily life. Statues were sometimes carved to serve as backup versions of the person in case anything ever happened to the body. Family members were expected to leave offerings at the tomb, and a person's name was carved and spoken as often as possible because the Egyptians believed that as long as a name was remembered and spoken, part of that person continued to exist. So the mummy wasn't the whole answer. It was the anchor for a much bigger structure built entirely around helping someone continue on. And what exactly were they continuing on toward? According to Egyptian belief, after death, a person's spirit would eventually face a moment of judgment. Imagine dying and then standing in front of the gods, watching your own heart placed on one side of a scale, balanced against a single feather representing truth and order. If your heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it would not balance evenly. If your life had been lived with honesty and balance, the scale would settle evenly, and the person could move forward into a peaceful, continued existence. It's important to remember that beliefs about this judgment and about the afterlife itself shifted over the centuries and weren't identical for every Egyptian across thousands of years of history. Now here's something worth clearing up. When people picture Egyptian mummies, they usually picture pharaohs, wrapped in gold, buried in massive stone tombs. But mummification wasn't reserved only for kings and queens. Wealthy officials, priests, and even everyday families took part in these burial customs, though the quality and detail of the process depended heavily on what a family could actually afford. A wealthy family might pay for the full 70-day process, fine linen, and a beautifully painted coffin. An ordinary family might only be able to afford a simpler, quicker version with far less decoration. The belief was shared. The budget wasn't. So why are we still finding these mummies thousands of years later? A huge part of the answer goes right back to where this story started, the hot, dry Egyptian climate. Even with all the advances in embalming, the desert environment played a major role in helping preserve bodies survive for so long. Add in sealed tombs, protective coffins, and careful burial conditions, and you get a rare combination that allowed some bodies to last for thousands of years instead of turning to dust. That's exactly why archaeologists today can study these preserved remains and learn incredible details about how ancient Egyptians actually lived, what they ate, how they aged, even illnesses they may have suffered from. So let's go all the way back to where we started. What happens after death? It's a question every human civilization has asked in one way or another. For the ancient Egyptians, the answer wasn't that death was simply the end. It was a continuation, one that depended on identity, memory, and yes, the body itself. The mummy wasn't just an attempt to preserve flesh. It was an attempt to preserve a person, to keep every piece of who they were intact enough to continue on into whatever came next. So the next time you see an image of an Egyptian mummy, wrapped in linen, resting inside an ancient G coffin, try to see it differently. You're not just looking at an old, preserved body. You're looking at thousands of years of human hope, care, and belief, all wrapped around a single, very human question. What happens after we die?